Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's Workshop. So this is part 2 of my Dollhouse furniture repairs and updates video. And this is that chest that I worked on in the first video to add the cabriole legs. But you can clearly see in this frame, I'm adding the hardware or the drawer pulls. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier video, this was a pre-owned piece that was never completed by the original artist. So what's really nice about this, it's already marked where the hardware or the drawer pull should be. So half the battle was already won. And although all my markings were in place and I didn't have to worry about that, I did have to be very careful and conscious where I placed my glue and to be very precise when I laid my hardware in place. So I'm kind of doing a dry fit, try fit to see how everything looks and how it'll be aligned before I actually begin to put my glue on. Now here's a quick glance of what it should look like after I add my glue. Now here I am in this frame being very careful and precise as possible to add the smallest amount of glue that I can to add my hardware. And after I placed my piece of hardware in the glue, I'm being very carefully and moving quickly to make sure everything is adjusted before the glue sets. Now, I could have used my Weldbond glue or my Gorilla Wood glue to add the hardware, but I just feel like the Loctite works really good with metal. But you need to be mindful, super glue gel doesn't have the same amount of wiggle room as wood glue. Now, you always want to be very careful and precise when you are adding your hardware because that can really make or break the realism of the piece. And although I have a history of being an excessive glue user, I've learned to manage the symptoms and practices that come along with suffering from EGU. And the way I manage it is by remembering what Daddy used to say to me when I was a little girl. He would say, "Slow down, what's the rush?" And to be quite honest, the rush was I wanted to finish the project so that I could play with it. And although now I'm technically a grown-up, I'm just glad that I never stopped playing. So now I just have to remind myself that I don't have to work with such urgency because now I have enough things that are ready to play with to last me the rest of my life. So now that that piece is done, let me show you what else I did. Now, this piece was a top of a sideboard that was a gift that came in a bundle of items from one of my precious dolls. And although it was all together and complete, it didn't have any legs. So in the high boy project, I replaced 2 legs, but in this instance, I'm going to have to replace all 4. So quite naturally, I'm using cabriole legs in the front, but the back leg I have to create. So I'm being a little radical. I'm cutting some stair spindles to be the legs to the back of this piece. Now, dolls, although I've really been trying to reform my ways when it comes to my excessive glue use, there are quite a few other areas of my creative process that I don't always follow best practice. So let's start with it would have been a best practice to actually measure how long I needed the legs to be and then cut each one of them individually to that particular marked length. But I didn't. I cut them both at the same time and I split the bottom of one of the legs. And it seemed like I could immediately hear my daddy say, "Haste makes waste." So save yourself the frustration of having to do it twice by doing it right the first time. So rather than ruining another spindle, I'm going to just use a little bit of my wood putty to mend the split. Now, this is generally used for filling in gaps and things like this, but in my case, I'm using it as a repair agent. So you see, I squeezed a little bit and I'm kind of like smushing it into the little part where I gouged it out. Now, I didn't smooth it in perfectly. I left it a little bit thick, a little bit lumpy, and then I'll be able to sand it down after it dries. So while I'm waiting for the wood putty to dry, I went on to stain the legs. Now, dolls, you should always use nitrile gloves when you're using wood stain and chemicals and things like that. So when it comes to safety, I want you to do as I say and not as I do because I did not have on my nitrile gloves. Always wear your gloves. Now I want you to take notice I did stain all the legs and I even stained the one that I added the wood putty to. Now in this next frame you can see I've added my glue. Now make sure that the part of the leg that you're adding is nice and level. I know that the cabriole leg was flat and level, but that other piece, because I cut it off of an existing spindle, you have to make sure that that's flat because if it's rounded, it's not going to adhere properly. Now you can see both pieces are on. There is a little oozing glue, so you want to make sure you clean that up immediately. And make sure you attend to any adjustments that are necessary before you allow it to dry. Now you can see that leg from this angle that I stained it and sanded it a little. Now originally when I got this piece, I thought it was a mass-produced miniature, but I realize now after seeing these cardboard components, this was a real-life miniatures kit build. So now that I'm done with adding the legs, I'm going to set it aside to dry before I move on to the next part of its process. Now I wanted to show you really quick a hack that I used for this piece. Now you may never have to use it, but sometime it comes in handy. I added a little teeny piece of coffee stir stick to shim the bottom of that back leg because it was slightly shorter than the cabriole leg. Now you may never need to do this, but it sure comes in handy in a pinch. Now it would be best to use a piece of coffee stir stick that was already previously stained, but either way you want to make sure the piece gets stained so that it makes it as undetectable as possible. So dolls, now you know the shims under those back legs are my little secret. So after finishing the bureau, I decided I wanted my sideboard to be a different color. So I pulled out this deep green color that I really like, but before I started, I added painter's tape over my hardware. Now, anytime you choose to paint a piece of dollhouse furniture, it's generally a good practice to sand off or remove the layer of lacquer. Now, my paint job was a little bit scrappy because the paint seemed to be very thin. I think I had watered it down from some previous usages. So it was crystal clear at this point that I would have to do multiple coats to get the desired effect. And dolls, I persevered, and this was my final result. And dolls, I have to say that it really turned out a lot better than I originally imagined. And I sanded it a little bit to make it look a little bit more worn. And then I remembered my rub and buff. And if you've watched my videos for any length of time, you know the antique gold is my favorite. Now, I didn't want the gold to be heavy, so I used a very light touch in little swipes just to give it a slight glint of that gilded look. And even though I liked the overall look of my paint job, I wasn't as neat as I could have been. So I'm going to have to come back and clean the rub and buff and the paint off of my drawer pulls. But if you're super neat, you can avoid this step altogether. Now, dolls, in a previous video, I assembled this bed to be the new bed for Pop and Miss Betty. And I hadn't finished their bed because I wasn't satisfied with the original design. So you can see in the original structure that the bottom of the bed didn't have slats. And I'm creating my own slats with popsicle sticks to fit to be the base support under the mattress. Now, I made sure not to over sand the little popsicle sticks because I wanted to maintain a little bit of tension between the sideboards because that teeny bit of tension will create a nice tight fit. And here are my popsicle stick slats all stained, fitted, and glued under the base of my bed. Now that the bed is fully assembled and stained, there are a couple little gaps that I wanted to fill. Now, dolls, these gaps or little spaces are just natural joints from the original construction of the components of the bed, but I wanted it to be smooth and even and level because I want to paint the bed. Now, after I added my wood putty, I just kind of smoothed it out with my finger to level it off, and I went all over the piece finding any kind of gashes or inconsistency in the wood so that everything would be smooth when I sanded it before I painted. And again, I suggest you use the finest sandpaper possible because you don't want to wear down your wood and compromise the integrity of your structure. So dolls, when I felt like my wood putty was reasonably dry, I went over everything again with another coat of my wood stain. Now dolls, while that final coat of wood stain was drying, I went on to add something a little extra. And I had this beautiful architectural piece that was gifted to me by my precious doll, Becky C. Because although I really liked the design of my doll's bed, I thought it was a little plain. So while the little architectural piece was drying, I added my Weldbond glue to the top of the headboard. And by the time I was done strategically applying the glue, the architectural piece was dry, and I added it right to the top, lining it up between the two side posts of the headboard. And it rested so neatly between those two posts, it was as though it was always meant to be. Now, I did hold it firmly in place for a little bit just to make sure I had good adhesion before I allowed it to dry. So, dolls, I took a little break and I came back to add my principal coat of paint. And this principal color was a latte type of brown, very similar to the wood stain color. It was really creamy and smooth, and I didn't want it to be solid or really opaque. So in order to get the look that I really wanted, I employed the concept of dry brushing, but I did multiple passes. And after I'd finished with my coats of the entire body of the bed, I went back to the part of the bed that started this whole process because my original idea was to make my little architectural piece look like it was all a part of the original design of the bed. So painting it all one color was going to make things come together really nicely. And the thing I really like most about this latte colored paint is that the shade allowed me to retain the warmth of the look of wood while seamlessly unifying the architectural piece with the body of the rest of the bed. So in this frame, you see I'm adding another layer of color. Now this is more of like an antique white, and I'm hitting the highlights or dry brushing the architectural piece because I'm trying to add age to the entire bed. Now when I refer to aging in this instance, I'm not necessarily trying to make the bed look old and worn, just antiqued. I wanted to give the bed a regal old world look. Now I did use this same antique linen color on the entire bed, dry brushing it just like I did the architectural piece. And when I was done with the linen colored paint, I came back with my antique gold rubbing buff to add a third subtle dimension of color. And when I was done with all the layers, I was really pleased with the way it looked, but I felt like it needed a little more of a patina. So I pulled out my alcohol and black paint wash. So for those dolls that are new to the channel, I mix a little bit of acrylic paint with a few shots of isopropyl alcohol. And I like to use alcohol rather than water because the alcohol evaporates really quickly and leaves what I consider a lovely stain. And I also used it on other parts of the bed to add a little bit of smudging to promote the look of shadows, which adds depth to all the tiny details. So dolls, I'm so excited to finally have Pop and Miss Betty's bed completed. So now I can go ahead and add the linen. Then I can focus on setting up the other details for the rest of their new home. Now, if this is your first time watching and you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. And always look for me on Mondays after 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And let me know in the comments what you like most about this video. And really quick, I want to say a warm welcome to all my new subscribers and to those precious dolls who've been with me a while. I want you to know how much I truly appreciate you. And I even want to say thank you to those of you who haven't subscribed, but you're watching. I appreciate you as well. So dolls, let me get back to this table because I have so much work to complete. But until next time, I'm looking forward to seeing you right here on Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now, dolls.